celestial phoenix drifted through the vast emptiness of deep space, its reinforced hull reflecting the distant glow of a dying star. Captain Kyle Voss sat in the cockpit, fingers tapping against the console, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of darkness ahead. The salvage mission had been routine: scan, retrieve, sell, until the ship's AI, Arvo, detected something unusual. "Unidentified distress beacon detected, Captain." Arvo's synthetic voice crackled through the speakers. "Signal frequency does not match any known human broadcasts." Kyle straightened. A distress beacon meant survivors, or a trap. He exhaled, rubbing a gloved hand over his face. The galaxy was a graveyard of lost ships and forgotten souls, and he had little interest in joining them. But his gut told him this was different. "Patch it through," he ordered. A flickering, holographic projection materialized above the console, distorted, static-filled, but unmistakably a distress signal. The ship's ID was unreadable, and its origin unknown. But what sent a chill down his spine was the underlying message buried beneath the static, whispered in a voice that sounded almost desperate. "Please, help me." Kale's grip tightened on the controls. He'd heard plenty of distress calls before, but something about this one dug under his skin, refusing to be ignored. "Captain," Arvo interjected, "sensors indicate minimal life support on the vessel. One life form detected, but readings are unstable." Just one? That wasn't right. Most ships traveled in crews, especially in hostile space. Kyle made his decision. "Prepare for docking. Keep the weapon systems online." "Acknowledged. Proceed with caution." The Celestial Phoenix aligned with the drifting vessel, its airlock hissing open as Kyle stepped into the unknown. The ship was eerily silent, save for the occasional flicker of failing emergency lights. The walls were scarred, evidence of a recent struggle. The air smelled of scorched metal and something faintly sweet, a scent that made his pulse quicken for reasons he couldn't explain. His boots echoed against the floor as he moved through the dark corridor, weapon drawn. Then, he saw her. Slumped against the bulkhead was a woman, or at least something close to a woman. Her body shimmered under the dim emergency lights, her skin reflecting a silver-violet hue that pulsed like liquid metal. Long silken strands of violet hair draped over her shoulders, framing delicate features that looked almost human. Almost. But it was her eyes that held him in place. Swirling galaxies of deep amethyst, far too ancient for a being who appeared so young. She blinked slowly, and her lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You smell delicious." Kyle stiffened. "What?" Before he could react, her body trembled violently, her chest rising and falling with erratic breaths. Her silver skin darkened, flushed with a color he hadn't seen before. She staggered toward him, her long clawed fingers reaching out, and for the first time in his life, Kyle Voss felt like prey. Kale's instinct screamed at him to step back, to raise his weapon, but something in the alien girl's expression stopped him. She wasn't attacking, she was struggling. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her body trembling as if caught in an invisible current. Her clawed fingers twitched, halfway between reaching for him and pulling back. "Hey," he said cautiously, his voice steady. "Are you injured?" Her glowing violet eyes locked onto his, and Kyle felt a strange heat ripple through the air between them. Then she shuddered violently. Her skin, shimmering silver a moment ago, deepened into a rich, iridescent hue, shifting like liquid under unseen forces. Her hips widened, her curves grew fuller, her features softening in a way that made Kale's heart slam against his ribs. Something about her was changing. She moaned, a sound so raw and primal that Kale's grip on his weapon faltered. "Your scent," she gasped, eyes fluttering as if dazed. "It's triggering my body's response." Kyle's mind raced. What the hell was she talking about? Her knees buckled, instinct took over, and he lunged forward, catching her before she hit the cold metal floor. The moment his hands touched her, she arched into him, her breath hitching. Her fingers dug into his chest, gripping the fabric of his jacket like a lifeline. A deep, throbbing purr rumbled from her throat. Kyle swallowed hard. What the hell is happening? Clarify, he demanded, trying to steady her. What do you mean my scent is triggering you? She trembled against him, blinking up with those glowing amethyst eyes. My species. We respond to chemical signals. Your sweat, your pheromones are... She bit her lip, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper. Making me evolve. Kale's pulse spiked. Evolve. She nodded weakly, her fingers tightening on his jacket. Chiron biology adapts to its perfect mate. You are my catalyst. His breath caught. Mate? His body went rigid. No, this was not happening. Arvo, Kyle muttered, activating his AI through his comm. Run a scan on our guest. Something is very, very wrong. Arvo's voice crackled through his earpiece. Captain, my sensors confirm rapid biological shifts in the life form. Her genetic structure is... The AI hesitated. Synchronizing with yours. Kale exhaled sharply. Explain. In simple terms, Arvo said, she's bonding with you on a genetic level. Kyle felt his stomach drop. The alien girl, Zira, as he would later learn, gripped his arm tighter, her body heating against his own. It's irreversible, she whispered. Kyle swore under his breath. This just became a problem. Kyle sat across from the alien girl in the dimly lit med bay of the Celestial Phoenix, arms crossed, eyes locked onto her. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence between them, but it did nothing to ease the tension thickening their air. She had stopped trembling now, but her body still seemed to be in flux, subtly shifting, softening, enhancing. It was unsettling. Kale had seen plenty of alien species before, some far more bizarre than Zira. But none of them had physically evolved just from being near him. None of them had ever looked at him like this. Her violet eyes shimmered under the medbay lights, pupils dilating as she exhaled slowly, as if forcing herself to stay still. So, Kale finally said, breaking the silence, you're saying my sweat, my scent, made you do all that? Zira tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Yes. He waited for more. She gave him nothing. Kyle pinched the bridge of his nose. You mind explaining why? A small amused smile tugged at the corners of her lips. You wouldn't understand. That was the wrong answer. Kyle leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table between them. Try me. Zira studied him, her glowing gaze drifting over. His features, his strong jaw, his storm-gray eyes, the slight sheen of sweat still on his skin from carrying her aboard. Her breathing hitched. Kyle didn't miss that. She licked her lips, a small subconscious gesture that made heat coil low in his gut. Chiron physiology is unlike your kind, she murmured, finally answering. We were a dying race. Our genetics were stagnating, failing to adapt. Then, through evolution, we developed the ability to imprint on a genetically superior mate. Kale stiffened. Imprint? She nodded. When we find a mate whose biology is strong enough to trigger our transformation, our bodies begin to evolve, molding us into the perfect counterpart for them. Her voice dipped slightly. For you. Kale's pulse kicked up, but he kept his expression unreadable. That's convenient. His tone was dry, but there was an edge of unease. Zira chuckled, low and husky. I assure you it is not. Kyle narrowed his eyes. You're telling me this has never happened before? Zira hesitated. Not like this, That made him pause. What do you mean? She inhaled deeply before answering. Usually it takes weeks, even months for the transformation to start. With you, it took minutes. Minutes. Kyle cursed under his breath. Zira watched him closely, her iridescent skin shimmering subtly as her body continued to adjust. Your scent is potent, she admitted softly. Every breath I take, every time I'm near you, it pushes the process further. I cannot control it. Kyle clenched his jaw. That explained why she had been so unsteady, why her body had reacted so violently. It was too much, too fast, and the way she kept staring at him. He exhaled sharply, pushing back from the table. All right, we need to set some boundaries. Zira arched a delicate brow. Boundaries. Yes, boundaries, rules, distance. He gestured between them. This is clearly a problem, so we need to figure out how to keep it under control until we can. She was already moving. In a blink, she was on her feet, closing the space between them in a fluid, predatory motion. Kyle tensed, every muscle in his body locking up as she leaned in. Her scent hit him like a drug. It wasn't just sweet anymore. It was intoxicating. Warm, dangerously inviting. Zira hovered inches from him, her eyes darkening, her lips parting slightly. You assume I want to control it. Kyle swallowed hard. Zira. Her fingers brushed over his chest, light as a whisper, tracing the fabric of his shirt. A shiver ran through him. Every time you move, every time you speak, your scent floods my senses. Her voice was velvet, laced with something primal. Kale forced himself to stay still. You're playing with fire, Zira smiled. I think you like the heat. His patience snapped. Kale grabbed her wrist, firm but careful, forcing space between them. Listen to me, Zira. This, whatever this is, has consequences. You said it yourself. If this continues, it's irreversible. Her expression shifted. For the first time, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not just desire, something dangerously close to longing. Kyle released her wrist and stepped back. She watched him, her chest rising and falling, her lips still slightly parted as if she wanted to say something else. Finally, she turned away. I will try, she murmured. Kyle exhaled. Good. He didn't know if he believed her, and worse, he didn't know if he wanted her to stop. The tension between them didn't break. If anything, it grew. Zira had promised to keep her distance. She failed. Not for lack of trying. Kyle could see the way she struggled, the way she fought against her instincts every time he was near. But the more time they spent on the celestial phoenix, the harder it became for her to resist. And for Kyle, it was becoming impossible to ignore. It started small. She would stand just a little too close. Her fingers would brush against his when handing him a tool. Her breath would hitch whenever he stepped into the cockpit after a workout, still damp with sweat. And then, one night, she lost control completely. Kyle had just finished his training session in the ship's gravity chamber, his muscles burning from the strain. His shirt clung to him, soaked from exertion. He ran a hand through his damp hair as he stepped into the corridor, the dim lights casting long shadows along the walls. And then he saw her. Zira stood frozen at the end of the hallway, her entire body shaking. Her violet eyes burned with undiluted hunger as they locked onto him. Kyle stopped in his tracks. Something was wrong. Zira? His voice was calm, controlled, but even he could hear the edge in it. She didn't respond. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. Her fingers twitched at her sides, claws unsheathing and retracting as if her body couldn't decide what to do with itself. She was fighting it. Kyle felt it, the pull between them, something primal, ancient, unstoppable. Then she snapped. 1 second, she was across the hall. The next, she She was on him. Kale barely had time to react before she shoved him hard against the bulkhead, her body pressed flush against his. The air between them ignited, an electric charge crackling in the space, where their skin almost touched. Her claws dug into his shirt, gripping the fabric tight as she inhaled sharply, her entire form trembling with restraint. I can't. Zira's voice was hoarse, desperate. Kyle's pulse pounded in his ears. She was burning up, literally. Her skin radiated heat, her iridescent flesh darkening, softening, molding into something that screamed feminine, fertile, perfect. And the worst part? His body reacted. Every instinct in him told him to pull her closer, to let whatever was happening happen. Instead, he grabbed her wrists and forced her back. "Zira, control it!" she snarled, an animalistic sound, foreign to anything he'd heard from her before. Her pupils dilated, her breathing ragged. "I'm trying," she gasped. "But your scent, it's drowning me." Kale's grip tightened. "Then fight it." Zira trembled, her fingers flexing against his chest. Then, with a shuddering breath, she did the last thing he expected. She collapsed against him, not in hunger, not in desire, in exhaustion. Kyle caught her instinctively, his arms wrapping around her as she sagged against him, her body trembling violently. Her breath was ragged against his neck. "I don't want to lose myself." Kyle's heart clenched. For the first time, he realized, she was afraid. Afraid that if she gave in to this, if she let the transformation consume her completely, she might not be her anymore. Kyle exhaled slowly, his hands gripping her shoulders, grounding her. "I've got you." His voice was firm, steady. "You're not alone in this." Zira didn't respond, but as she melted into him, her breathing slowing, he felt her body stabilizing. The transformation hadn't stopped, but now it was controlled, and Kale knew, deep down, he was the only thing keeping her from losing herself. The moment of fragile peace didn't last. A sharp alarm blared through the ship, cutting through the silence like a blade. Kyle stiffened. Proximity alert. Zira's head jerked up from where she had been resting against his chest, her glowing eyes widening. She knew. Kale tapped his communicator. "Arvo, report." The AI's voice crackled to life, its tone uncharacteristically urgent. "Captain, an unidentified fleet has entered scanning range. Large vessels, Chiron energy signatures confirmed." Kyle's jaw clenched. Damn it, they had found her. Zira staggered away from him, her body still trembling from the transformation. But there was no hesitation in her movements now, just cold, sharp realization. "They've come for me." Kale's mind raced. He didn't know much about the Chiron Dominion, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't gentle with deserters, especially ones undergoing forbidden transformations. "What are our options?" he asked. Arvo's response was immediate. "Evading is not an option, Captain. Their warp engines outmatch ours. The fleet will intercept us in 3 minutes." 3 minutes. Kale turned to Zira. "Tell me the truth. What happens if they take you back?" Her expression darkened. "They will separate me from you, force me into stasis. My transformation will be undone, my body returned to its pure state." Kyle's stomach twisted. "And after that?" She hesitated. "They will eliminate the contamination." It took Kyle a second to process what she meant. They'd erase her. Not just the transformation. Her, like she had never existed, like she had never mattered. Something inside him snapped. "Over my dead body." Zira's breath hitched. "Kale." "We fight." He turned toward the cockpit, already making his way toward the weapons controls. Zira grabbed his arm. "You don't understand." Her voice was urgent. "They will not just destroy you, they will erase you from history itself. No records, no remains, no trace that you ever lived. They have done it before." Kyle met her, Gaze, unwavering. Let them try. The ship shuddered as the enemy fleet locked onto them, the energy buildup of their weapons vibrating through space itself. Then the communication panel blinked to life. A cold, disembodied voice filled the cabin. Zira of the Shiren Dominion, surrender yourself immediately. Your transformation is a violation of our genetic code. Your contamination must be purged. There will be no warning. Kale stepped forward, arms crossed. Yeah, you can go to hell. Silence. Then, human. The voice dripped with disdain. You are irrelevant. Step aside and you may be spared. Kale grinned. Funny, I was about to say the same to you. The energy in the air shifted. Zira gasped, grabbing her chest as her body pulsed with an unnatural glow. Her skin shimmered, shifting, adapting at an even faster rate. Kyle felt it, a charge between them, something bigger than either of them. Zira looked up at him, eyes blazing with new light. I can stop them. Kyle frowned. How? Her fingers brushed against his, sending a shock through his system. By completing the transformation. Kyle's pulse thundered. He didn't understand all of it, how Shiren biology worked, how he, of all people, had triggered her evolution. But he did understand one thing. If Zira completed this, she wouldn't just be a Shiren anymore. She would be something new, something the Dominion couldn't control, something they feared. Kyle looked at her, saw the conflict in her eyes. She wanted this, but she was afraid. Afraid of what she would become, afraid of losing herself. Kyle gripped her hands, grounding her. You won't lose yourself. His voice was steady, firm. You are Zira. No matter what happens, that won't change. Her lips parted, slightly. Then, resolve hardened in her gaze. She closed the distance between them, pressing her forehead to his. And then, she let go. A pulse of raw energy exploded from her body, rippling outward like a supernova. Kyle barely had time to react before his vision went white, and the entire ship trembled under the force of her rebirth. The explosion of energy rippled across the ship, knocking out lights, systems, and even gravity itself for a brief moment. Kyle gritted his teeth as he floated in the air, shielding his eyes from the searing glow emanating from Zira's form. She was changing. No, she was ascending. Her silver-violet skin pulsed with an otherworldly radiance, her form shifting, stabilizing, solidifying into something entirely new. The iridescent shimmer of her body deepened, the curves and sharp edges of her Shiren biology perfectly balancing with something human, a fusion, a new species, born in defiance of the universe's rules. Kyle's stomach twisted in both awe and unshakable protectiveness. Because if she was this powerful now, they were going to want her even more. The ship's systems rebooted in a stuttering, flickering hum as Zira's transformation finally settled, and when her eyes snapped open, Kyle forgot how to breathe. Gone was the purely alien glow. Now, in her deep violet irises, streaks of silver lightning flashed, like distant stars colliding in the void. She exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the control panel as the ship steadied beneath them. Kyle caught her before she could fall. His hands found her waist, hers found his shoulders. The moment their skin touched, a shock of warmth passed between them. Not like before, when it had been raw and uncontrollable. This time it was right, balanced, perfect, complete. Zira's lips parted, her breathing steadying, her body no longer trembling with instability. Kyle. He swallowed, his grip firm but gentle. You okay? She lifted her hands, flexing her fingers, watching the way her body moved, felt, reacted. A slow, almost delighted smile spread across her lips. I am Hole, a voice interrupted them. Warning, incoming fire detected. Kale snapped back to reality. The Shiren fleet hadn't left. In fact, they had doubled down. Outside the viewport, the flagship of the Dominion loomed like an eclipsing planet, energy building in its cannons. And this time, they weren't giving warnings. Kyle moved instantly. Arvo, prepare the jump drive, now! Calculating coordinates, Captain. Too slow. Way too slow. Kyle gritted his teeth, already searching for evasive maneuvers. The Shiren ships were too close, their energy weapons already charging, until Zira moved. Kyle turned just in time to see her lift her hand, and then the entire battlefield shifted. A wave of invisible force rippled outward, touching the enemy fleet like a whisper of a cosmic storm, and then the Shiren ships blinked out of existence. Kyle froze. What just happened? Zira lowered her hand, her expression unreadable. I moved them. Kyle blinked. You moved them? As in, out of this sector, far from us. She turned to him, her silver-violet skin glowing under the dim cockpit. Lights. They will not find me again. Kale exhaled. He didn't understand half of what just happened, but he knew one thing. She had just rewritten the rules of the universe. And the universe would never be the same. Epilogue. A future unwritten, the celestial phoenix drifted through space, now surrounded by nothing but silence. Zira stood at the edge of the viewport, arms crossed, her reflection half human, half something more. Kyle approached, standing beside her. So, what now? She turned to him, a slow, knowing smile tugging at her lips. Now? She echoed. Now we chart our own course. Kyle chuckled, shaking his head. That sounds a lot like trouble. Zira leaned in, her voice a whisper against his ear. Then let's make it fun. And as the ship's engines flared to life, carrying them toward uncharted stars, Kale realized something. He hadn't just found an alien, he had found his equal. And together, they were going to rewrite the cosmos. Loved the story, want more. HFY romance? Let me know what kind of sci-fi adventure you'd love to see next. Drop your thoughts, theories, and sequel ideas in the comments. Should Kyle and Zira start their own galactic rebellion? Should they discover even bigger secrets about the universe? Let's hear it.